So thank you so much for being here today. Let me just start with a kind of a rumor in China. Not technically, but it's a notion. It's a notion that people, floating around on the Chinese social media saying that, the business elites in the western and eastern part of the U.S. are more pro-China or friendly with China, but folks in the central or southern part of the U.S. are a bit more skeptical. So you have spent a lot of time in Texas. Could you tell us how the people there really see China and also their opinion on the Chinese people?
First of all, I think the notion that you refer to about people on the coasts being, let's say, friendlier toward China is reflective of a reality that, generally speaking, people on the coasts and people that live in big cities tend to be more politically liberal than people who live in the heartland or in the south of the United States. And I think that that is generally true. If you look at the electoral map in presidential elections, you'll see that the northeastern part of the United States and the entire west coast of the United States tend to vote for the Democrat for president, and the heartland and the south tend to vote for the Republican, generally speaking. There's a couple of exceptions or a couple of states that are swing states. But with respect to the issue of how Americans view China, I would say that there's some additional texture that I would add to that, and that is that overall, in the United States over the last several years, U.S. public sentiment toward China has deteriorated to a very significant degree across the board. And so, for example, Washington, D.C. is considered a liberal city, but it's also the capital of the United States, and it's where the Congress of the United States is. And I would say that the political class in Washington is very negative on China, even though they're on the coast, if you will. And yet, in the heartland, there are any number of businesses and universities and nonprofits that engage with China in a very friendly way. So I think while it's true that the coasts tend to be more liberal, generally speaking, with respect to China, it's a somewhat more complex picture. And I think a lot of things have happened in recent years, both in terms of Chinese actions, but probably more importantly, in terms of the U.S. political framing of China, that have caused sentiment to deteriorate, so that it would be hard to say that in most parts of the United States you'll find a significant number of Americans who view China positively at this point, unfortunately.
So the negative attitudes towards each other seem to prevail between China and the United States recently. And in your opinion, what are the root causes of these negative perceptions? And how can we break through this?
Yeah, I think it's going to be tough to break through in the near term, but I think when you look at the root causes, they're slightly different in each direction. So I think a lot of Chinese look at U.S. actions and certainly U.S. rhetoric, meaning rhetoric from the executive branch of the U.S. government and certainly from the legislative branch, from the United States Congress, and perceive correctly that there is an incredible level of negativity toward China that comes through the language of our elected leaders in the United States, and that also comes through the media and certain other voices. And I think Chinese hear that, they see what's on television, they see what's in the blogosphere, and they conclude that the United States is acting in ways that are very unfriendly toward China. And I think that's not an unreasonable conclusion. And I think that has colored Chinese sentiment toward the United States. And my impression, based on the data that I've seen and kind of my own relationships with friends and people that I've known for a long time, is that Chinese sentiment toward the United States has also deteriorated and is not as positive today as it was some years ago. And even though at an individual level there's still a lot of friendship and a lot of goodwill, I think perceptions of the United States is that the United States is trying to hold China down and do things to China that are detrimental to China's interests. And so I think that's the root cause. And in addition to that, I think you see a narrative in the Chinese media that tends to kind of push sentiment in that direction. In some ways, a similar dynamic to what you see, the media systems are different, but the similar effect to what you see in terms of the media in the United States driving a negative narrative with respect to China. In the US, I think there are two fundamental types of reasons why I think US sentiment toward China has deteriorated to the degree that it has. And right now, favorable views toward China in the United States are at an all-time low based on US polling. On the one hand, certain things that China has done, at least as they have been described by the American media and by American politicians, have caused Americans to have concern about China, whether it's the balloon incident, whether it's the issue of Chinese actions relative to Taiwan and so forth. And these actions on China's part have generated a negative response among the American people. But I think maybe the even more significant driver of negative sentiment in the United States toward China is US domestic political rhetoric. So irrespective of what China does, whether it does something that's bad for America or does something that's good for America or does something that's neutral, the US political establishment tends to characterize Chinese actions as bad for America in every case. And that rhetoric has been pounded into the psyche of the American people for the last 7 years or so, 6 or 7 years, and it has created a mentality in the United States that basically everything China does is bad by definition. By the very fact that China is doing it is proof that it's bad for America. It's a very much a zero-sum mindset. And I think that it's probably less Chinese actions per se and more US political rhetoric per se that has driven that sharp deterioration in US public sentiment toward China.
Absolutely. China has also been talking about the resurgence of McCarthyism in the United States and the growing irrational hostility towards China. And you have suggested that the United States should take more rational and less ideological approach toward China. In dealing with China, and can you elaborate on what you think the U.S. should do differently to achieve that?
I do think that, and I said back in 2018 that I think we have entered, or had entered at that point, a period of McCarthyism 2.0, and I was probably one of the first people in the United States to use that particular phrase at the time, and now 5 years later I think we see that playing out in a lot of different ways. You mentioned the word irrational. A good example of the kind of thing I've talked about, and it's one example among others that one could cite, the U.S. approach to tariffs is irrational. It is not in the interests of the United States to have tariffs on the vast swath of incoming Chinese imports, because in the end it's bad for America. The tariffs raise prices for consumers, raise prices for factories that are getting inputs from China, and ultimately that gets translated into inflationary pressures that hit consumers hard. In the end, it generates job losses. One estimate had that 250,000 US jobs were lost because of the US tariffs on incoming Chinese imports. And the list of things that it does to distort the economy and hurt the American consumer is a long list. And it's done nothing to reduce the deficit, which was the stated goal of the tariffs in the first place, or to resolve any of the underlying trade issues that actually still do exist in the US-China relationship. So from the standpoint of pure rationality and looking at the national interests of the United States, the tariffs make absolutely no sense. They're bad for our country. They give the United States no leverage whatsoever over China. In fact, on the contrary, they give China considerable leverage over the United States. And it's a foolish policy that was implemented by President Trump, but also continued by the Biden administration. It is one example among others that could be cited where we're doing something to satisfy an emotional desire to do something, even when the something that we're doing is bad for us. And as I've often said over the last 5 years, the Trump administration found a solution to the trade issues, but the only problem was that the solution ended up being worse than the problem. And it just doesn't make any sense. It's an example of how emotion and ideology and anti-China sentiment prevails and national interests lose out because we're doing things that are not in our interest. And I think we see that in a number of different areas. And we see it not only at the federal level, but we also now start to see it. We are starting to see it in terms of actions that are occurring in state legislatures as well.
With the recent increases in the U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, do you think there will be a war in the near future?
I don't. I know that it's a tremendously sensitive and important issue for China, and of course it's an issue that's taken on a lot of importance for the United States. And frankly, the United States and China simply don't see the issue the same way, and that's why there's a constant and permanent tension and friction around this between the United States and China. But I don't think that that is going to devolve into military conflict anytime in the foreseeable future. In my judgment, every day that the Chinese leadership does not go into Taiwan militarily is a day that evidently the Chinese leadership has assessed and judged that the costs of doing so outweigh the benefits. And I believe that assessment is correct. And I believe that the Chinese leadership ultimately is acting rationally. And so I think the concerns that have been expressed by some in the United States in recent years, the last couple of years, that China is on the verge of going into Taiwan militarily, I think those concerns are overstated. And I think they don't take into account the calculus and the analysis that the leadership, I think, engages in to assess whether doing that would be worth it or not. And my judgment is that the Chinese leadership understands that the risks of such an approach would be great. The potential for a bad outcome from China's standpoint are significant. And I think China is generally a fairly risk-averse nation when it comes to these types of actions. And I don't think we're going to see a military conflagration across the Taiwan Strait anytime in the near future, or even in the coming decades. There will always be tension. There will always be a pretty fundamental disagreement at the core level about Taiwan between the United States and China. China's goal is reunification, and the U.S. goal is, quote, peaceful resolution. And the two are not necessarily the same thing. And obviously China strongly opposes U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, and so on and so forth. All of that will continue, but I am not of the belief that we're going to see military conflagration anytime soon.
With the recent visit by Ma Ying-jeou and Tsai Ing-wen to the United States, so what's your take on the long-term outlook for the Taiwan tensions?
Well, the way I often say it is that you have this status quo that has held for a long time, where the United States, for example, has an unofficial relationship with Taiwan. It is not a formal diplomatic relationship. The United States does have a formal diplomatic relationship with the People's Republic of China. China wants to reunify and leaves all options on the table, but does not seem inclined to use force at this time for the reasons that I've mentioned. Taiwan, very few people in my judgment, based on the data, support the idea of unification or reunification, but there's also very little support for declaring independence, which would cross a red line. So you have this status quo that has obtained for a very long time, for decades. And the way I would phrase it is that the status quo that we see across the strait right now, and with respect to Taiwan's status, is the absolutely worst possible situation, except for every other possible conceivable scenario. Meaning it's the least worst situation. It's the one situation that seems to prevent the likelihood of conflict, or certainly significantly decrease the likelihood of conflict. And so, as is often said in sort of popular parlance in China, sometimes the best solution to a problem is no solution, at least for a long time to come. So I think the status quo has a certain staying power. And I think that we're going to see the status quo continue for a very long time to come, irrespective of whether the DPP wins the presidency or whether the KMT wins the presidency, And I would argue, irrespective of who wins the presidency in the United States or who controls Congress, and obviously in China the governance picture is clearer, I don't think there will be any fundamental change to the status quo for a very long time to come, simply because no one can think of a situation that produces a better status quo than the current situation.
So you've also highlighted the potential for climate cooperation between China and the US. And how do you think that climate cooperation would shape the overall China-US relations? And it seems like traditional issues like politics and ideology still have a big impact. So what's your perspective on this?
Well, I think there are a few issues where there clearly is a common interest and a commonality of interest between the United States and China. Climate is probably one of the biggest and most important ones. There's no question that the world can't make significant progress on the issue of climate change without the United States and China, among many others, working in concert. But you're not going to solve or make progress on climate change if the United States is not involved and or if China is not involved. And ultimately, you have to work together to generate the outcome that all of us want to see. And that's true on a number of other issues as well, whether it's the issue of nuclear non-proliferation, arms control, the situation in Afghanistan, the Iran nuclear process, arguably, even the issue of Russia's war on Ukraine. China has its own perspective, which is somewhat different than that of the United States and many other countries. But it's clear that China wants to play a role, or says that it wants to play a role in trying to bring peace to Ukraine and to end the conflict. There are disagreements as to how that can be achieved, but on all of these issues, it's important that the United States and China be able to work together in a business-like way and not allow very strong and probably irreconcilable differences on a number of other issues get in the way, not allow it to get in the way of collaboration where collaboration makes sense for both countries. And the fact is, there are areas where it makes sense for the United States and China to work together, whether that's pandemic, countering pandemics, whether it's trying to find a cure for cancer, whether it's other scientific collaboration, whether it's dealing with piracy on the high seas, dealing with terrorism to the extent that that continues to be an issue at certain times, and the other issues that I've mentioned, nuclear non-proliferation and so on. There are quite a few items on the positive side of the ledger where the United States and China can and should work together, not out of altruism, but because it's in the interest of both countries to do so. And I think the Biden administration has wisely indicated that it understands that that is so, and I think that's appropriate. And I think China has also wisely indicated that it's receptive to working together where it makes sense to do so. The politics in both countries, and especially in the United States, often gets in the way of that. And that's unfortunate, but hopefully leaderships in both countries can recognize that it's in our interest to, in some ways, compartmentalize and recognize there are some things we're never going to agree on, and that's the reality, whether we like it or not. But what do we do about the things where we can agree and can work together? My hope is that we recognize it makes sense to do so, and I think that's the mindset of this administration, and that's encouraging.